"You have to do this, Yannick, please, they're driving me crazy," Georgiana hissed, her manicured nails digging into the sleeve of my favourite worn-out sweater. "Do what?" I asked, staring at the elaborate cheese board she'd practically shoved into my hands. "You said you needed help fixing a sink." I lied. She gave a frantic, almost unhinged smile, smoothing her flawless silk dress. "My parents are inside. Just smile, nod, and whatever you do, don't tell them you're just the guy from apartment 4B. "Wait, what am I then?" She opened her front door. "Mum, Dad, this is Yannick, my boyfriend." Yannick Tomescu lived a quiet, unremarkable life in apartment 4B. He was an architect by trade, a man who preferred the predictable geometry of drafting tables to the messy chaos of human relationships. His sanctuary was a one-bedroom walk-up in a slightly crumbling pre-war building in Brooklyn, smelling faintly of old paper and the roasted espresso beans he ground every morning. He liked his life. It was safe. It was contained. Then there was Georgiana Jessen in 4A. Georgiana was a force of nature. She was the kind of woman who moved with a hurricane's chaotic energy, leaving a trail of discarded designer shoes, half-finished canvases, and a faint scent of expensive gardenias in her wake. She was an art consultant, whatever that meant, and seemed to subsist entirely on iced matcha lattes and the adrenaline of last-minute deadlines. They weren't friends. They were mere acquaintances connected by a shared, paper-thin wall through which Yannick routinely heard her blasting French pop music at ungodly hours, and through which she probably heard him cursing at his recalcitrant drafting software. Their interactions were limited to polite nods at the mailboxes or the occasional awkward silence in the cramped elevator. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with wild dark hair and eyes the colour of storm clouds, but Yannick knew better than to entangle himself with a woman who clearly thrived on drama. Until the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. It had been raining for 3 days straight, a cold, relentless downpour that mirrored Yannick's mood. He was buried under a looming deadline for a mixed-use development project, his eyes aching from staring at blueprints. He was just reaching for his third cup of lukewarm coffee when a frantic, rapid-fire knocking echoed from his front door. He sighed, pushing his glasses up his nose, and wrenched the door open. Georgiana stood there looking surprisingly distressed. Her usually immaculate hair was piled haphazardly on her head, and she was wearing a silk dress that looked entirely too formal for a Tuesday evening at home. "Yannick," she breathed, her voice tight with an urgency that immediately set his teeth on edge. "I need your help. Please. It's an emergency." "Is the building on fire?" he asked dryly, leaning against the doorframe. "Worse," she said, glancing over her shoulder toward her own door as if expecting monsters to emerge. "My kitchen sink is leaking everywhere. It's a disaster. I don't know how to fix it, and the super isn't answering his phone. You're an architect, right? You know about plumbing and stuff?" Yannick frowned. An architect wasn't a plumber, but he possessed a basic understanding of wrench mechanics, and she looked genuinely panicked. He wasn't a monster. "Fine," he grumbled, stepping out into the hallway. "Let me grab my toolbox." "No time!" she cried, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. "Just come. Now." He barely had time to register the absurdity of the situation before she was dragging him down the hall and shoving him through the doorway of 4A. The moment he stepped inside, he knew something was wrong. There was no sound of rushing water. There was, however, the unmistakable aroma of roasting duck, garlic, and rosemary. The apartment was immaculate, softly lit by dozens of candles, and the dining table was set for 4 with fine china and crystal glasses. Yannick stopped dead in his tracks. "Where's the leak?" Georgiana slammed the door shut behind them and leaned against it, closing her eyes for a brief second. When she opened them, the panic had been replaced by a desperate, pleading look. "There is no leak," she confessed, her voice dropping to a whisper. Yannick stared at her. "Excuse me?" She grabbed an elaborate cheese board from the kitchen counter and thrust it into his hands. "You have to do this, Yannick. Please, they're driving me crazy." "Do what?" he asked, bewildered, looking from the artisanal Gouda to her frantic face. "You said you needed help fixing a sink." I lied. She gave a frantic, almost unhinged smile, smoothing her flawless silk dress. "My parents are inside. Just smile, nod, and whatever you do, don't tell them you're just the guy from apartment 4B. Yannick felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "Wait, what am I then?" Before he could drop the cheese board and bolt, Georgiana spun around and threw open the double doors leading to the living room. "Mom, Dad," she called out, her voice suddenly dripping with a saccharine sweetness Yannick had never heard before. This is Yannick, my boyfriend. Yannick froze. Standing by the fireplace were two impeccably dressed people. The man, tall and silver-haired, looked like he had stepped out of a catalogue for luxury yachts. The woman, dripping in understated diamonds, had the exact same storm cloud eyes as Georgiana, but hers were narrowed in sharp, assessing calculation. "Well," the woman said, her voice like cut glass, "finally. We were beginning to think he was a figment of your imagination, Georgiana." Yannick felt his jaw unhinge. He looked at Georgiana, a silent plea for her to end this madness. Instead, she slipped her arm through his, her fingers digging painfully into his bicep. "He's very real, Mother," Georgiana said, beaming up at him with terrifying conviction. "Darling, these are my parents, Mohammed and Kelly." Yannick was trapped. He was holding a cheese board he didn't want, in an apartment he'd never been in, standing next to a woman he barely knew, who had just introduced him to her wealthy, intimidating parents as the man she loved. The urge to run was overwhelming, but the vice-like grip on his arm told him escape wasn't an option. "Hello," Yannick managed to croak out, feeling like an absolute idiot. Mohammed stepped forward, extending a hand that looked like it had never known a day of hard labor. "Yannick, a pleasure, Georgiana has told us. Nothing about you." "I like to maintain an air of mystery," Georgiana chirped, steering Yannick toward the seating area. Yannick sat down stiffly on a pristine white sofa, placing the cheese board on the coffee table as if it were an explosive device. He was an architect. He built things with structure, rules, and predictable outcomes. This situation lacked all three. He was falling down a rabbit hole, and the woman dragging him down was smiling like an angel while orchestrating a disaster. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Kelly Blazek, Georgiana had quickly whispered her mother's maiden name, noting she kept it professionally, was the lead interrogator. She ate her duck with surgical precision while dismantling Yannick's life story piece by piece. "So, Yannick," Kelly said, swirling a glass of Bordeaux, "Georgiana says you're an architect. What kind? Corporate? Residential? Are you an associate, or do you have your own firm?" Yannick swallowed a piece of duck that suddenly tasted like ash. "I work for a mid-sized firm in Manhattan. Vento and Darrell. We mostly do mixed-use urban developments." "Vento and Darrell," Mohammed mused, finally entering the fray. "Razvan Vento? I played golf with him at Shinnecock last summer. A bit cautious in his designs, wouldn't you say?" Yannick stiffened. He respected Razvan. "He values sustainability and community integration over flashy aesthetics," he defended, surprised by his own vehemence. Kelly raised an eyebrow, a tiny, patronizing smile playing on her lips. "How quaint. And how long have you and our daughter been together?" Georgiana's knee knocked against his under the table. It was a sharp warning. He had no idea what the timeline was supposed to be. 6 months, Georgiana interjected smoothly, saving him. "We met at a gallery opening in Chelsea. He was brooding in a corner, critiquing the structural integrity of the sculptures." It was a blatant lie, but it sounded alarmingly plausible. Yannick had been to exactly one gallery opening in his life, and he had indeed spent the evening wondering how a precariously stacked tower of rusted hubcaps hadn't collapsed and killed someone. 6 months, Kelly repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "And yet, this is the first we're hearing of him. We were beginning to think that charming young man Lewis was still in the picture." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Georgiana's fork clattered against her plate. "Lewis and I ended things a year ago, Mother. You know that." "Louis Cassiano," Mohammed explained to Yannick, ignoring his daughter's distress. "Brilliant hedge fund manager, comes from a very good family. They were quite serious." Yannick felt a strange prickle of irritation. He didn't know Louis Cassiano, but he immediately disliked him. "I see," Yannick said, his voice neutral. "Lewis understood the demands of Georgiana's world," Kelly continued, her eyes locked on Yannick. "The galas, the networking, the expectations. Do you understand those expectations, Yannick? A mid-level architect from—" She paused, her gaze sweeping over his slightly wrinkled sweater. "Where did you say you grew up?" "I didn't," Yannick replied, his patience wearing thin. "But it was upstate. A small town you've never heard of." "How rustic," Kelly murmured. The rest of the meal passed in an agonizing blur of thinly veiled insults and probing questions. Yannick found himself playing the part with unexpected dedication, perhaps fueled by a stubborn refusal to be cowed by these snobbish people. He deflected Kelly's barbs with dry humour and engaged Mohammed in a surprisingly deep conversation about urban zoning laws, drawing on his actual expertise. By the time dessert, a delicate pear tart that Yannick couldn't even taste, was served, he was exhausted. But he also noticed something else. Georgiana, usually so vibrant and loud, was shrinking into herself. The manic energy that had driven her to drag him in here had evaporated, leaving behind a woman who looked tired, anxious, and deeply insecure in the presence of her parents. When Mohammed and Kelly finally announced they were leaving to catch a flight to Palm Beach, Yannick felt profound relief. At the door, Kelly leaned in to kiss Georgiana's cheek. "He's very grounded, dear. A bit plain, perhaps, but certainly an improvement over your usual flighty artist types. Though I still don't see why you threw it all away with Lewis." Georgiana flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but Yannick saw it. "Safe flight, mother," she whispered. Mohammed shook Yannick's hand. "Interesting ideas on the zoning issues, Tomescu, though I still think you lack ambition. Good night." The door closed with a solid click, and silence descended upon apartment 4A. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of extinguished candles and unspoken words. Georgiana stood by the door for a long moment, her shoulders slumped. Then slowly she turned to face him. The bravado was gone. She looked small and vulnerable. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "I am so sorry." Yannick crossed his arms, leaning back against the wall. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. "What was that, Georgiana? Who is Lewis? And why did I just spend 2 hours pretending to be your boyfriend?" She walked over to the sofa and collapsed onto it, burying her face in her hands. "It's a long story." "I'm not going anywhere," he said, surprising himself. "And you owe me a very good explanation." Georgiana didn't look up immediately. She sat there, a portrait of defeat in a designer dress, the silence stretching between them. Yannick didn't push. He walked into the kitchen, found 2 clean tumblers, and poured a generous measure of the expensive whiskey Mohammed had left on the counter. He handed her a glass and sat down in the armchair opposite her. She took it with a shaking hand, taking a slow sip before finally looking at him. Her storm-cloud eyes were red-rimmed. "They're suffocating," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "My parents, they have this script for my life, the right schools, the right career, the right husband, and Lewis." She swallowed hard. Lewis was the perfect leading man for their script. Yannick took a sip of his own drink. The whiskey burned nicely going down. "The hedge fund manager." "Yes," she laughed humorlessly. "He was brilliant, wealthy, charming. He fit perfectly into their world, and for a while I thought he fit into mine. What happened?" "He didn't want me," she said, looking down at her glass. "He wanted the version of me my parents created, the polished, perfect accessory. Whenever I wanted to stay in and paint, he'd drag me to a gala. If I laughed too loudly, he'd subtly touch my arm to shush me. He was slowly erasing me, piece by piece." "So you left him?" "I broke off the engagement a year ago," she confirmed. "My parents were devastated. They acted like I'd committed a crime. They've spent the last 12 months trying to fix my life, setting me up on disastrous blind dates, threatening to cut off my trust fund if I didn't settle down." "Trust fund," Yannick noted dryly. "Must be tough." She shot him a glare. "I know how it sounds, spoiled rich girl complaining. But it's not about the money, Yannick. It's about control. They told me they were coming for dinner tonight, and they strongly implied they were bringing another suitable candidate for me to meet. I panicked. And you thought grabbing the guy next door and declaring him your boyfriend was the logical solution. I didn't think, she cried, throwing her hands up. I was terrified. I just wanted them to back off. I needed a buffer. I needed someone they couldn't immediately categorize and dismiss. Well, congratulations, Yannick said, setting his glass down. I think I confused them sufficiently. Plain, grounded, and lacking ambition. A real catch. Georgiana winced. I am so sorry they said those things to you. They are terrible people, Yannick. You didn't deserve that. I've had worse client meetings, he shrugged, though the insults had stung more than he cared to admit. But you can't keep this up, Georgiana. You can't lie to them forever. I just needed to buy some time, she pleaded, leaning forward. Just until after the holidays. They go to St. Bart's for Christmas. If they think I'm settled, they'll leave me alone. Yannick stared at her. Wait, you're not suggesting... Please, Yannick, she begged, her eyes wide and desperate. Just a few more weeks. Just a few public appearances, a fake date or two, I'll pay you. I'll owe you a massive favor. Anything. I'm an architect, Georgiana, not an actor, and definitely not an escort. He stood up, running a hand through his hair. The situation was spiraling out of control again. I'm not asking you to be an escort, she protested, standing up to face him. I'm asking you to be my friend, to help me out of a desperate situation. We are not friends, he pointed out bluntly. We are neighbours who occasionally share an elevator. Then let's be friends, she countered quickly, moving closer to him. The scent of gardenias washed over him, intoxicating and dangerous. You helped me tonight. You defended yourself. You actually handled my father, which no one ever does. You were amazing. Yannick took a step back, feeling dangerously off balance. She was too close, too beautiful, too chaotic. This is a terrible idea. Probably, she agreed, a tiny, genuine smile breaking through her anxiety. But it's the only plan I have. Before he could firmly decline, before he could retreat to the safety of his apartment and his blueprints, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his boss, Simone Darrell. Need you at the office early tomorrow. Huge issue with the Hudson project. Client is threatening to pull out. Bring your A-game. Yannick sighed, the weight of his real life crashing back down on him. He didn't have time for Georgiana's melodrama. He needed focus. He needed stability. I can't, he said, turning toward the door. I have my own problems, Georgiana. I can't fix yours. He walked out, closing the door firmly behind him. He walked the 5 steps to his own apartment, unlocked the door, and stepped into the quiet, dark space. It was exactly as he'd left it, smelling of coffee and old paper. Safe. Predictable. But as he stood there in the dark, he realized the silence felt different now. It didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt empty. And the faint, lingering scent of gardenias seemed to have followed him inside. Yannick barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, the phantom scent of gardenias drifted through his bedroom, a maddening reminder of the chaos he had narrowly escaped. He had spent the remaining hours of the night staring at the ceiling, mentally reinforcing the walls of his carefully constructed, predictable life. He was an architect. He knew how to build fortresses. Georgiana Jessen was a wrecking ball he had successfully dodged. But when he arrived at the sleek glass-paneled offices of Vento and Darrell in Midtown Manhattan at 7 a.m., his fortress immediately began to crumble. The atmosphere in the firm's central conference room was toxic. Simone Darrell, a razor-sharp woman who wore her ambition like a suit of armor, was pacing the length of the room. Her heels clicked against the polished concrete floor in a frantic staccato rhythm. At the head of the long oak table sat Razvan Vento, the firm's visionary founder, massaging his temples as if trying to push a migraine out of his skull. Scattered across the table were the intricate 3D printed models of the Hudson project, a massive, multi-million-dollar mixed-use complex that was supposed to be the crown jewel of Yannick's burgeoning career. He's pulling out. The madman is actually threatening to pull the funding, Simone snapped, coming to a halt and glaring at the model. 2 years of zoning battles, structural engineering and environmental impact studies, and Odd Broberg wants to scrap it because the plaza lacks soul. Yannick took his seat cautiously, setting down his oversized thermos of black coffee. Broberg? I thought he signed off on the minimalist plaza design 3 months ago. Odd Broberg changes his mind like the wind over a Norwegian fjord, Razvan muttered, his heavy Romanian accent thickening with stress. He visited the site yesterday. He stood in the pouring rain, stared at the empty space where the central atrium will be, and declared it felt like a hospital for robots. He wants warmth. He wants narrative. He wants world-class art installations integrated into the very bones of the structure. Simone slammed a manicured hand onto the table. He gave us 72 hours to present a comprehensive, integrated art program that complements the architecture. Or he takes his checkbook to a firm in London. We are architects, Razvan, not gallery curators. We don't have the contacts to pull together a multi-million-dollar art proposal in 3 days. Then we find a consultant, Razvan said, his voice exhausted. Someone with impeccable taste, ruthless negotiating skills, and the ability to speak Broberg's pretentious, abstract language. Everyone worth their salt in this city is booked a year in advance, Simone countered, crossing her arms. I called 3 agencies this morning. They laughed at me. Yannick stared at the miniature, perfectly scaled trees of the plaza model. A cold dread began to pool in his stomach. Someone with impeccable taste, someone who speaks abstract language, an art consultant. The universe, Yannick decided, had a deeply twisted sense of humor. "I might know someone," Yannick said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Simone whipped around, her eyes narrowing. "Who?" "She's an independent art consultant," Yannick explained carefully, feeling the sudden intense scrutiny of both senior partners. "She specializes in contemporary integration. She's very connected." "What's her name?" Razvan asked, sitting up straighter. "Georgiana Jessen," Yannick replied. Simone marched over to her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. A tense silence stretched over the room for 30 seconds before Simone let out a low whistle. "Jessen, okay. She curated the lobby installations for the new Vanguard Towers in Dubai last year. Her portfolio is aggressive, highly modern, and wildly expensive. She's exactly the kind of shiny, prestigious name Broberg would drool over." Simone looked up, fixing Yannick with a terrifyingly bright smile. "Get her!" "It's not that simple," Yannick backpedaled, his palms sweating. "She's extremely busy. We're not exactly close, we just know each other." "Yannick," Simone said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "If the Hudson project dies, the bonuses die, the promotions die, we might have to lay off half the junior drafting team. I don't care if you have to grovel, bribe, or sleep with this woman. Get Georgiana Jessen in this office by tomorrow morning, or don't bother coming in yourself." Yannick swallowed hard. The fortress had just been breached. He nodded slowly, knowing exactly what this was going to cost him. "I'll talk to her tonight." At 7:30 p.m, Yannick stood in the dim hallway outside apartment 4A, feeling like a man walking to his own execution. He took a deep breath, adjusted his glasses, and knocked. It took a full minute for the door to open. When it did, the sight of Georgiana momentarily robbed him of his prepared speech. Gone was the flawless, silk-clad socialite from the night before. Instead, she stood barefoot in a pair of paint-splattered men's sweatpants and an oversized torn t-shirt. Her dark hair was tied back in a messy knot, and there was a streak of cadmium-red paint across her left cheekbone. She was holding a palette knife like a weapon. She blinked at him in surprise. "Yannick, have you come to yell at me again?" "I need your help," he blurted out, deciding pride was a luxury he couldn't afford today. Georgiana's eyebrows shot up. She slowly lowered the palette knife, a slow, wicked smile spreading across her lips. She stepped aside and gestured dramatically into her apartment. My, how the turntables. Please come into my parlor." Yannick stepped inside. The apartment was a disaster zone in the daylight. Canvases leaned precariously against every available wall surface. The dining table where they had suffered through duck and interrogation was now covered in sketches, fabric swatches, and half-empty coffee cups. It was chaotic, loud, and vibrantly alive. He stood stiffly near the kitchen island and explained the situation. He told her about Odd Broberg, the hospital for robots, and Simone Darrell's ultimatum. He watched her storm-cloud eyes sharpen as her professional brain engaged, absorbing the details with terrifying speed. "Odd Broberg," she mused, tapping the palette knife against her chin. "He's a nightmare. A visionary, but an absolute nightmare. He wants an emotional narrative, not just pretty pictures." "Can you do it?" Yannick asked, holding his breath. "Can you put a pitch together in 2 days?" Georgiana walked over to the kitchen sink, running the blade of the knife under the water. She turned off the tap and leaned against the counter, fixing him with an unwavering stare. "I can," she said softly. "But I think we both know I don't work for free, Yannick." "The firm will pay your emergency consulting rate," he assured her quickly. "Simone authorized it. Whatever you ask." "I don't want your firm's money," Georgiana said, taking a step toward him. The scent of turpentine and gardenias surrounded her. "I want exactly what I asked for last night." Yannick closed his eyes, a sigh escaping his lips. "Georgiana, quid pro quo, Yannick," she said, her voice firm but lacking its usual manic edge. "You need a miracle to save your career. I need a boyfriend to save my sanity. You play the devoted, grounded, anti-Lewis architect until my parents leave for St. Bart's on December 26th, and I will hand-deliver a brilliant, foolproof art integration plan that will make Odd Broberg weep with joy." He looked at her. She looked ridiculous with the red paint on her face, but her eyes held a desperate sincerity. He realized with a sinking feeling that they were two drowning people clinging to each other. "Fine," he grumbled, "but we need ground rules. I'm not kissing you in front of your mother." Georgiana clapped her hands together, her face lighting up with genuine delight. "Deal, and you're in luck. Our first public test is tomorrow night." Yannick froze. "Tomorrow?" "Madeleine Bush is hosting a private gallery opening in Chelsea," Georgiana explained, already moving toward a stack of papers to find a pen. "Madeleine is a viper, an art critic and my mother's favourite spy. If we convince Madeleine we are madly in love, she'll report back to my parents, and they'll lay off. Plus, rumour has it, Broberg will be there. We can corner him, soften him up, and prime him for the pitch." "Two birds," Yannick murmured, dreading every second of this. "One terrifying stone," Georgiana agreed, sliding a piece of paper toward him. "Now sit down. If we're going to convince Madeleine Bush, we need to get our story straight. What's your middle name, Tomescu? And do you have any allergies I should pretend to worry about?" For the next 2 hours, they sat amid the chaos of her apartment, constructing a fictional romance. They argued over where they supposedly had their first date. She wanted a rooftop bar. He insisted on a quiet bookstore cafe to fit his boring persona. Agreed on their fake anniversary and practiced holding hands across the table. When her warm, paint-stained fingers intertwined with his, Yannick felt a sudden electric jolt shoot up his arm. He looked up, catching her eye. For a fraction of a second, the playful banter vanished, replaced by a heavy, breathless tension. Georgiana quickly pulled her hand away, clearing her throat and intensely studying her notes. "Right," she whispered. "That should be enough to fool Madeleine." Yannick looked at his empty hand, suddenly acutely aware of how quiet his own apartment was going to feel tonight. Madeleine Bush's gallery in Chelsea was a cavernous, aggressively sterile space that looked exactly like the hospital for robots Odd Broberg despised. The walls were blindingly white, the floors were poured concrete, and the art consisted mostly of large monochromatic squares that Yannick suspected meant absolutely nothing. The room was packed with the city's elite. Waiters in severe black turtlenecks wove through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne that cost more than Yannick's monthly rent. "Shoulders back, darling," Georgiana murmured, slipping her arm through his. Yannick adjusted the cuffs of his dark navy suit. He felt like an imposter. Georgiana, however, was in her element. She wore a stunning emerald green velvet gown that clung to her curves and made her storm cloud eyes pop. She was a vibrant slash of colour in a room determined to be colourless. "There's Broberg," Georgiana whispered, nodding subtly toward a massive, bearded man in a tailored tweed suit who was currently scowling at a canvas painted entirely beige. "Let's work." Watching Georgiana operate was like watching a master conductor lead an orchestra. She glided up to the eccentric Norwegian developer, introducing Yannick smoothly before effortlessly pivoting the conversation to the Hudson project. She didn't pitch him, she seduced him with ideas. She spoke of kinetic metal structures that captured the wind off the river, and interactive light installations that shifted colour based on the pedestrian traffic. Yannick watched, mesmerised. She wasn't just a chaotic rich girl, she was a brilliant, deeply intuitive professional. By the time they excused themselves, Broberg was practically eating out of her hand, eagerly anticipating the formal presentation at Vento and Derul. "You were incredible," Yannick said genuinely as they walked toward the bar. Georgiana flushed, a real unpracticed smile touching her lips. "I told you I was good at my job, Tomescu." "Georgiana, what a quaint surprise." The voice was smooth, cultured, and dripped with condescension. Yannick turned to see a man who could only be described as aggressively handsome. He had perfectly coiffed hair, a bespoke tuxedo, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Next to him stood an older woman with sharp features, a severe bob, and a gaze that swept over Yannick like a scanner looking for defects. Georgiana's grip on Yannick's arm tightened to the point of pain. "Louis, Madeleine, hello." This was Louis Cassiano, the hedge fund ghost, and Madeleine Bush, the spy. "I heard a rumour you were dating a civilian," Louis purred, his eyes raking over Yannick's off-the-rack suit. "Louis Cassiano. And this is our lovely host, Madeleine." "Yannick Tomescu," Yannick replied, keeping his voice even. He didn't offer his hand. Madeleine sniffed delicately. "Tomescu. Kelly mentioned you. An architect, she said. Though from what I hear, Georgiana is the one designing the Hudson project for you." It was a blatant, calculated insult designed to emasculate him and belittle Georgiana's career in one breath. Yannick felt Georgiana shrink against him, the vibrant energy she had shown with Broberg instantly evaporating under Lewis's suffocating presence. Yannick felt a surge of protective anger that had nothing to do with their fake contract. He looked at Lewis, then at Madeleine. "Georgiana isn't designing the building, Madeleine," Yannick said smoothly, his voice carrying the calm authority he used to calm panicked contractors. "She's elevating it. Architecture provides the skeleton, but art provides the soul. My firm creates the structure. Georgiana is the genius who ensures it actually means something. I'm just lucky she lets me watch her work." He shifted his stance, wrapping his arm firmly around Georgiana's waist and pulling her flush against his side. It was a fiercely possessive gesture, a direct challenge. "Isn't that right, darling?" Lewis's smug smile faltered, a flash of genuine irritation crossing his polished features. Madeleine looked momentarily taken aback by the sheer confidence of the statement. Georgiana looked up at Yannick, her eyes wide, lips slightly parted in shock. The gratitude in her expression was profound, but underneath it, Yannick saw something else, a spark of real, breathless wonder. "Excuse us," Yannick said dismissively, holding Lewis's gaze for a second longer than necessary. "We need to catch our breath." He steered her away from the crowd, pushing through a set of heavy glass doors that led to a secluded outdoor terrace overlooking the city lights. The cold night air hit them, a welcome relief from the suffocating atmosphere inside. As soon as the doors closed, Georgiana leaned against the brick wall, exhaling a shaky breath. "Oh my God, you completely shut him down." "He's a pretentious ass," Yannick said, shoving his hands into his pockets to hide the lingering adrenaline tremors. She looked at him, the emerald dress shifting in the moonlight. "Thank you. No one has ever spoken to Lewis like that. No one has ever defended my work like that." "I meant every word," Yannick admitted softly. "You're brilliant, Georgiana." The air between them suddenly shifted, becoming thick and charged. The sounds of the traffic below faded away. Georgiana stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing the lapel of his suit, tracing the fabric in a way that felt agonizingly intimate. Yannick's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked down at her lips, forgetting the contract, forgetting Odd Broberg, forgetting the reasons why this was a terrible idea. He leaned in, closing the distance between them, the scent of gardenias pulling him under. Just as their lips were about to brush, a bright, blinding flash of light exploded from the corner of the terrace. Yannick jerked back, blinking rapidly against the spots in his vision. He whipped his head around, catching the retreating back of a photographer slipping back through the glass doors into the gallery. "What the hell was that?" Yannick hissed. Georgiana looked pale, her fingers flying to her mouth. "That was Madelife's society photographer. By tomorrow morning, that picture will be in my mother's inbox." The game had just leveled up. By 8 a.m. the following morning, the photograph was everywhere that mattered. Madeleine Bush's society blog, The Chelsea Eye, had published it under the headline, "Avant-garde romance, Jesson heiress finds soul in mid-level architect." The picture was undeniably spectacular. Captured in the silver moonlight of the terrace, it showed Yannick leaning in, his hand resting possessively on the brick wall beside Georgiana's head. Georgiana was looking up at him, her eyes wide, her lips parted in a breathless sigh. They looked like the tragic, passionate heroes of a classic film. "My mother has already called me 4 times, Georgiana said, pacing the length of Vento and Darrell's conference room. She was wearing a razor-sharp cream pantsuit that made her look like a terrifying angel of commerce. She left a voicemail saying the photo was vulgarly intimate, but admitted you looked less provincial in a tuxedo. Yannick stood by the window, watching the Manhattan traffic crawl below. "So the spy network did its job. Are we safe?" "We're in the eye of the hurricane," Georgiana muttered, stopping to straighten a perfectly straight 3D printed tree on the Hudson Project model. "Now, we just have to survive Odd Broberg." At exactly 9 a.m., the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open. Odd Broberg swept in, bringing the scent of pine and freezing rain with him. He was flanked by Razvan Vento, who looked like he was about to pass out from stress, and Simone Darrell, whose smile was so tight it looked painful. "Ah, the brilliant Miss Jesson," Broberg boomed, ignoring the senior partners entirely to clasp Georgiana's hands. "And Tomescu, the man who understands that architecture is merely the canvas." "Mr. Broberg," Georgiana smiled, instantly transitioning into her professional persona. "We have something extraordinary to show you." For the next 2 hours, Yannick watched a masterclass in persuasion. He handled the structural logistics, walking Broberg through the reinforced load-bearing pillars and the spatial flow of the central atrium. But it was Georgiana who brought the cold concrete to life. She pitched a cascading, interactive water feature that utilized the building's grey-water recycling system, designed by a reclusive Japanese artist Broberg idolized. She proposed a hanging garden installation of bioluminescent flora that would illuminate the plaza at night, turning the hospital for robots into a living, breathing ecosystem. Yannick found himself seamlessly feeding off her energy. When she described the emotional impact of the light hitting the atrium at dawn, Yannick pulled up the exact sun path rendering on the monitors to back her up. They moved around the table in an intricate, unchoreographed dance. They weren't just a fake couple, they were a formidable team. "It is magnificent," Broberg whispered, leaning heavily on the table, his eyes shining with actual tears as he looked at the final rendering. "You have given my building a heartbeat, Georgiana, and you, Tomescu, you built the ribs to protect it. I am in." Razvan let out a breath that sounded like a deflating tire. Simone actually clapped her hands together. The Hudson project was saved. The bonuses, the promotions, the prestige, it was all secured. "We will finalize the contracts by Friday," Broberg declared, standing up and buttoning his tweed jacket. "I expect both of you to oversee the implementation personally. I won't have my vision compromised by middle management." "You have our word," Yannick said, shaking the giant Norwegian's hand. As the senior partners escorted a jubilant Broberg to the elevators, Yannick turned to Georgiana. The adrenaline was still pumping through his veins. She looked at him, her storm cloud eyes sparkling with triumph, and launched herself into his arms. Yannick caught her, spinning her around once before setting her down. He was laughing, actually laughing, in the middle of his sterile corporate office. "We did it. You were incredible." "We did it," she corrected, her hands lingering on his shoulders. The playful energy faded, replaced by the heavy electric tension from the terrace the night before. Before either of them could close the distance, a slow, mocking clap echoed from the doorway. "Bravo, a truly touching performance." Yannick turned. Leaning against the doorframe, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than a car, was Louis Cassiano. "Louis," Georgiana said, stepping back from Yannick, her voice dropping 20 degrees. "What are you doing here? This is a private office." "I have a meeting with Razvan and Simone," Louis smiled, stepping into the room. He walked over to the architectural model, looking down at it with sneering disdain. "You see, my hedge fund, Cassiano Capital, just acquired a massive, controlling stake in the holding company that owns Vento and Darrell. I suppose that makes me your new boss, Tomescu." Yannick felt the blood drain from his face. His fortress wasn't just crumbling. Louis had just bought the land it was built on. "You're lying," Georgiana snapped. "Check the financial wires, darling," Louis purred. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Yannick with cold reptilian malice. "I don't like losing, Tomescu, and I certainly don't like mid-level nobodies embarrassing me in public. You thought you could play in my world? Let's see how you handle the consequences." The atmosphere in Vento and Darrell shifted from jubilation to a funeral dirge in less than an hour. Simone and Razvan returned from the executive suite looking like they had aged 10 years. Louis's acquisition was real, hostile, and entirely legally binding. Yannick sat at his drafting table, staring blankly at his monitors. The triumph of the Hudson project had turned to ash. Louis now had the power to fire him, scrap the project, or worse, keep him on and torture him professionally for years. At 6 p.m, Yannick's phone buzzed. It was a text from Georgiana. "My apartment. Now." He crossed the hall and knocked on 4A. Georgiana opened the door instantly. She had changed out of her cream suit into an oversized grey sweater. She looked pale, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "Come in," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. Yannick stepped inside. The apartment had been completely cleared of the chaotic art supplies. The canvases were stacked neatly. The paint-stained drop cloths were gone. It looked clinical. It looked like Louis. "What happened?" Yannick asked, a sense of dread pooling in his stomach. "Louis came to see me after he left your office," Georgiana said, standing rigidly by the kitchen island. She wouldn't meet his eyes. "He made me an offer." "An offer?" Yannick scoffed. "He's a blackmailer, Georgiana. What did he say?" "He said that if I agree to give our relationship another try, if I go with my parents to St. Bart's for Christmas and bring him along as my fiancé, he will leave you alone." She finally looked up, and her eyes were terrifyingly blank. "He'll greenlight the Hudson project. He'll make sure you get the lead architect credit. He'll secure your entire career." Yannick stared at her, his mind struggling to process the words. "And if you say no?" "If I say no, he fires you tomorrow. He blacklists you in the industry. He uses his capital to ensure no major firm in the city will touch your portfolio. He destroys you, Yannick." "Let him try." Yannick stepped forward, his voice fierce. "I don't care about the firm. I don't care about Louis Cassiano's money. I know how to build from the ground up." "Well, I do care," Georgiana snapped, stepping back. Her voice was harsh, brittle. "I care about my life, Yannick. This little game of ours was fun, but it's gotten completely out of hand. I'm exhausted. My parents are thrilled that Louis is back in the picture. It's easier this way." Yannick froze. The words felt like physical blows. "Easier? Georgiana, you told me he was erasing you. You said he suffocated you." "I was being dramatic," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "I'm an artist. It's what we do. Look, Yannick, you helped me out and I helped you save your job. We're even. The contract is over. You don't have to pretend to care anymore." "Pretend?" Yannick asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Do you honestly think I was pretending on that terrace last night?" Georgiana flinched, turning her head away to look out the window into the dark Brooklyn night. "It doesn't matter. It was a mistake. I'm going back to Louis. The Hudson project is yours. Congratulations." She was dismissing him. She was pulling up the drawbridge and locking him out. Yannick stood there for a long moment, looking at the rigid set of her shoulders. He wanted to yell, to argue, to shake some sense into her. But he was an architect. He knew when a structure had fundamentally collapsed. "Fine," Yannick said, his voice hollow. "If that's what you want. Have a nice life, Georgiana." He walked out, the heavy door of 4A clicking shut behind him with an agonizing finality. Yannick went into his own apartment and sat in the dark. He poured himself a glass of water, his hands shaking slightly. He replayed the conversation in his head over and over. Her coldness, her sudden reversal. Then, his analytical brain, the brain that spotted microscopic flaws in structural blueprints, snagged on a detail. The apartment. She had cleaned up the apartment. She had hidden her canvases, her paints, her mess. She had erased herself before Louis even had the chance to do it. She's lying. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt. She wasn't going back to Louis because it was easier. She was going back to him to protect Yannick. She was sacrificing her own freedom, her art and her sanity to buy Yannick his dream project. She was throwing herself on a grenade for a guy she claimed was just a fake boyfriend. Yannick stood up, the glass shattering against the floor as he dropped it. He wasn't going to let her do it. He had spent his entire life building safe, predictable fortresses to keep the world out. It was time to become a wrecking ball. The Fuller Blazek pre-Christmas gala was the kind of event that required armed security, a guest list guarded like nuclear codes, and attire that cost more than a college tuition. Held in the opulent, gold-leafed ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, it was a gathering of New York's most terrifyingly wealthy elites. Yannick Tomescu did not have an invitation. He did, however, have intimate knowledge of the hotel's service corridors, having studied its original 1920s blueprints for a restoration proposal 3 years ago. He slipped past the kitchen staff in a sharp, tailored black suit he had bought that afternoon, spending half his savings in the process. He didn't look plain, he didn't look grounded. He looked like a man with nothing left to lose. He emerged from behind a velvet curtain into the dazzling light of the ballroom. A string quartet was playing a haunting Vivaldi piece over the murmur of cultured voices. It took him less than 10 seconds to find her. Georgiana was standing near the grand fireplace, flanked by her parents, Mohammed and Kelly. She was wearing a stunning, restrictive silver gown that looked like a suit of armor. Next to her, looking impossibly smug, was Louis Cassiano, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. Georgiana looked utterly lifeless. The storm-cloud eyes were dull, staring blankly at a passing waiter. Yannick didn't hesitate. He strode across the marble floor, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Conversations died away as he passed, the society crowd parting for him like the Red Sea. He was a foreign object disrupting their perfect ecosystem. "Excuse me," Yannick said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the string quartet. Georgiana's head snapped up. She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Yannick!" Louis turned, his smug smile faltering into a scowl. "Security! How did this peasant get in here?" Mohammed Fuller stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Tomescu, what is the meaning of this? You are not welcome here." I'm not here for the champagne, Mohammed, Yannick said smoothly, his eyes locked entirely on Georgiana. I'm here to decline a job offer. Kelly Blazek sneered. Are you drunk? Leave before we have you arrested. Lewis, Yannick said, turning his gaze to the hedge fund manager. You told Georgiana you would ruin my career if she didn't come back to you. You told her you would use your new stake in Vento and Darrell to fire me and blacklist me. A collective gasp echoed from the eavesdropping guests. Lewis's face turned an ugly shade of magenta. You're insane. I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't care about the Hudson Project, Yannick declared, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. I don't care about the lead architect title, and I don't care about Vento and Darrell. You can keep it all, Lewis. You can burn it to the ground for all I care, because none of it means a damn thing to me if it costs Georgiana her freedom. He stepped closer, ignoring Lewis, and reaching out to take Georgiana's hands. They were freezing cold. You don't have to protect me, Yannick said softly, the rest of the room fading away. You don't have to put yourself back in a cage for my sake. I love you, Georgiana. Not as a fake boyfriend, not as a contract. I love your mess. I love your art. I love the gardenias. I love you. A tear slipped down Georgiana's cheek, ruining her perfect makeup. Yannick, you're throwing away your dream. You are my dream, he replied. This is incredibly touching, truly, Lewis spat, recovering his venom. But it doesn't change reality. You're fired, Tomescu, and I'll see to it you never build so much as a doghouse in this city again. Actually, Lewis, a deep, booming voice echoed from the crowd. I think you'll find your influence is somewhat overstated. The crowd parted again to reveal Odd Broberg. The massive Norwegian developer was holding a glass of scotch, looking vastly amused. Mr. Broberg, Lewis backpedaled, his eyes widening. I wasn't aware you were in attendance. I go where the narrative is. Broberg smiled grimly. And I despise corporate bullies. I had my lawyers look into Cassiano Capital's aggressive acquisition this afternoon. It seems Lewis leveraged assets he didn't quite own to secure his position. Assets tied to my development firm. Broberg took a sip of his scotch. I've pulled my funding. Cassiano Capital is currently bleeding out on the stock exchange floor. You don't own Vento and Darrell, Lewis. You barely own the suit you're wearing. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Louis Cassiano looked as though he had been physically struck. He looked at Broberg, then at the judging eyes of the society crowd, and finally at Georgiana. Without a word, he turned and fled the room. Mohammed and Kelly stood frozen in shock. Georgiana let out a sob that was half laugh, half cry. She threw her arms around Yannick's neck, pulling him down to her. Right there, in front of the most judgmental people in New York City, Yannick kissed her. It wasn't a fake kiss for the cameras. It was real, desperate, and filled with the promise of a spectacularly chaotic future. A month later, the wall between apartment 4A and 4B was legally and loudly demolished. Yannick realized that while fortresses were safe, they were also incredibly lonely. He preferred the beautiful, vibrant mess of living with a wrecking ball. The Hudson Project broke ground in the spring, a perfect synthesis of structure and soul, much like their relationship. Georgiana never had to pretend again, and Yannick learned that the most profound architecture isn't built with concrete and steel, but with courage, vulnerability, and the willingness to let someone tear down your walls. Thank you so much for watching Yannick and Georgiana's story. If this emotional rollercoaster of fake dating, corporate drama, and true love kept you hooked, please like this video, share it with your fellow romance lovers, and hit that subscribe button for more original heart-pounding stories every week. Let me know in the comments what your favorite twist was.